Hello, what's up everyone? Welcome to this new live stream, the third one in this very busy WWDC week. So earlier this week we covered Swift data, we covered Swift macros. I did a recap in video of what got me excited during the keynote and the State of the Union. But even with my best effort, it's of course impossible for one person to cover all of the cool new content that has been announced since the beginning of the week. So for this new live stream, I'm doing something different than what we did the 2 days before. This time I want to read with you some blog articles that were written by other members of the iOS community. They are all about what has been announced at WWDC since the beginning of the week. So it's basically my live newsletter format that I've done already, I think 3 times already this year. So as usual, I have selected 5 blog articles. Some of them are from authors that I've already covered in the past. Some of them are from new bloggers. I'm quite excited about reading them because I haven't read them before. This way I'm still discovering and I'm still learning with you live, and I think that's what makes a big part of the interest of this live stream. So Benjamin was saying congratulations again for the 10,000 subscribers. Thank you. Thank you. It was super nice to see this happen just a few weeks before the WWDC. It was perfect timing. And so last thing I will say before I start the actual content for the live stream is that first in the description you have the links to the articles, so if you want to check them out by yourself you can absolutely do it. And then if you are watching live, please don't forget that there is a chat. Any question, any remark you can have, you can share them in the chat, and this way it makes the whole process much more interactive and much more fun. So let's get started with the first article I've selected. It's from the blog Swift with Majid. I'm not sure I've ever covered this blog in my live newsletters, but I've read articles from this blog a lot of time, and so that's why I definitely trust the quality of its content. And in this article, we're going to learn what is new in SwiftUI after WWDC 23. And spoiler, in the next article, it will be the same thing, but for UIKit. So let's get started. You can see the article is dated from the 6th of June, so from Tuesday, so the day after the beginning of the WWDC. So WWDC 23 is here. So many things have changed and been added to the SwiftUI framework. In this post, you can find a summary of the most significant SwiftUI features available in the 5th iteration of the framework. It's true, it's already the 5th year for SwiftUI, so it was announced in 2019, then 2020, 21, 22, 25. So yeah, it's already SwiftUI 5.0. So let's see about the data flow. Swift 5.9 introduced the macros feature, what we covered yesterday, which became the heart of the SwiftUI data flow. SwiftUI became Combine free and uses the new observation framework now. So this is one of the big news of this WWDC. SwiftUI no longer uses Combine under the hood. It of course begs some interesting question on what will be the future of Combine, but at least Combine was introduced alongside SwiftUI in 2019. Well, now SwiftUI is no longer relying on Combine. So the observation framework provides us with the observable protocol that we have to use to allow SwiftUI to subscribe to changes and update views. So the code looks like this, and you can notice that you don't need to conform to the observable protocol in your code. Instead, you mark your type with the @observable macro. So if you were already there yesterday, you might remember that this is what is called an attached macro. You can invoke a macro either in a freestanding way, like you would call a function, or you can attach it to an existing type, but also it could be also a method, so you can attach it to an existing, I don't know, like code concept, I guess we could say, and this way it will enhance this concept. And so here you mark your type with the @observable macro, which makes that conformance to the protocol observable for you. You don't need the @publish property wrapper now because SwiftUI automatically tracks the changes in the available properties for any observable type. So here we have our store, which is a class, which is annotated with @observable, and you can see that in the rest of the class, there is no other mention of things that should be implemented in order for the store to be observed by an external object. It's different than when we were using observable object, because of course we would make the type conform to observable object, but also we would need to explicitly annotate each property that should generate a redraw in the UI with the @publish property wrapper. Now it's no longer the case. And so if we take a look at a products view which uses this store, so you can see that now we also store, I was about to say what is going to happen after, so I will just read what is written. So previously there were a bunch of property wrappers like @state, @stateObject, @observedObject, and @environmentObject. And it's true that they were a bit complex because you had to understand when and why to use each of them. If you followed my my training course, which is available for free on my channel, how to learn SwiftUI when you already know UIKit, you might remember that we spent a bit of time covering which property wrapper should be used when. Actually, observed object, I'm not sure. Was it a property wrapper, this one? I'm not sure. I don't remember this one. But maybe I just never got to when I need to use it. Oh yes, no, yes, of course, okay. State object, observed object, and then there is environment object. Okay, yes, it's this one that confused me because I was like, there is the one when you own and the one where you don't own the object, and there is this extra one. And you had to understand when and why to use them. Nowadays, state management has become much more manageable. You will only use the state property wrappers, both for value types like strings and integers, and reference types conforming to the observable protocol. So in the example above, so this example here, we have a view that accepts the store type. In the previous iteration of the SwiftUI framework, we should mark it with the @observedObject property wrapper to subscribe changes. We don't need it now because SwiftUI views automatically track changes in the types conforming to the observable protocol. So it means that basically we only kept @state, and stateObject, @stateObject became @state. So these two were merged together into @state, and this one got completely removed. So here, in a way, I guess the property wrapper is not so much about tracking updates like it was before, but it's about ownership and making sure that when the view is recreated, the instance is not recreated with it. Right. So here is where I was, and now it's about environment. So it seems we no longer use @environmentObject. We use @environment and we pass the type. That's interesting because before we would use @environmentObject and specify the type explicitly, and then it would be inferred by the property wrapper. This argument right here would be inferred from the type of the variable. Now it's the other way around. And so let's see the example. So you can also use the environment property wrapper in pair with the environment view modifier to put the observable type into the SwiftUI environment. So this is okay. So when we want to inject it, we no longer call environment object, just environment, and to get it, we just do @environment. So it's even more simplified, even though the logic here is still the same than with the @environment object we had before. There is no need to use the @environment property wrapper or the environment object view modifier. The same environment property wrapper works with the observable types now. So this is pretty great because this complexity that there was in SwiftUI around which property wrapper you needed to use when, and you had to use different property wrappers for value types and for reference types, and also different ones whether you had ownership or not of the data. It seems now it's been simplified, and that's definitely a welcome change. It will also make the barrier of entry to learning SwiftUI even simpler because you don't need to learn about all the possible cases that you had to deal with before. let's see what we have then. Oh yes, at bindable. You can use the new bindable property wrapper whenever you need to extract a binding from the observable type. So if you followed the live stream on Swift Data, you might remember that it took me a bit of time to find that I had to use this one at some point, because let's imagine. So the bindable, it's when you need to have a binding, meaning when you need to have a two-way data flow. I guess that here in this example right here, we are displaying the list of items of favorites in the store, but we are not updating them. So it's not a problem that it's not bindable, because there isn't any change to what is inside the store. But in the other example, we have a text field, and so the text field expects a binding because it will need to update a string in response to user inputs. And so in order to get a binding from the store which is observable, you use the @bindable property wrapper, and then you use the same syntax than the one that was introduced in Swift with iOS 14, which is you put a dollar both on the collection that you iterate on, but also on the argument of the closure. And finally, with the dollar, you are able to pass a binding. So this syntax always feels a bit weird, in the sense that if you don't know the trick, it's hard to guess it. But it's been there for quite some time in SwiftUI. Benjamin, you're saying, any idea if existing code, observable object, etc. will continue to work, or will everything have to be refactored? Great question. I guess this isn't covered in the rest of the article, so because then it switches to animation, so I can discuss it briefly. From what I read on Twitter, the two of them can coexist. I think that the documentation says that you can use both @bindable and also conform to observable object and have @publish properties. And what will happen is that before iOS 17, so when your app runs on a device that is on iOS 16 or lower, it will use the observable object protocol and the @publish properties. And when your code runs on iOS 17 or higher, then it will use the @bindable and the bindable protocol. So the two of them can coexist, and you don't need to refactor your code immediately. And I guess also that observable object, if you don't refactor it to use @bindable, it won't break either with iOS 17. Even though I didn't read it explicitly in the doc, but it would be very weird, because it would mean that all of the SwiftUI apps would break on iOS 17 if they are not updated. So I guess you shouldn't have to worry that your app won't work on iOS 17, but just make sure of it, just to be sure. But the great part is that both observable object and @observable can coexist. So during the transition period, if you want, you can implement both. Now, from a software engineering point of view, I'm not sure yet whether it's a good strategy, because implementing both approaches means that you could have different behavior on iOS 16 and iOS 17. So that might mean like more bugs. So I don't know. As a software engineer that wants to to minimize the bugs, I would tend to say like wait until when you will support only iOS 17, you can say, okay, I will implement my new view models using observable, and then maybe later I will migrate my older view models that still use observable objects. But if you still need to support iOS 15 or 16 next year, honestly, they say that you can do both observable object and @observable, but in a way you also make room for more bugs. So I would say like you need to really think it through, and between what is the cool thing to do and the responsible thing to do, you might want to think it through and at least have an approach where you are aware of the risk, basically. Okay, so we covered the observable, the changes in how SwiftUI observes changes. This is, of course, a very high-level overview. There are some really interesting subtleties, especially when you are reading property inside the closure you pass to a list, for instance. So you really want to read the fine prints of the doc for observable because there is room for some subtle bugs. Also, don't forget, if you're watching the replay maybe weeks, months, or years in the future, we are just 3 days after the keynote. These articles, they were all written using the first beta of Xcode 15, so it's very possible that some of the things described in these articles will be changed by the time the final version of iOS 17 gets released. So now for animations. So animations always was the most vital part of the SwiftUI framework. It is effortless to animate anything in SwiftUI, but previous framework versions lack some features that we have now. So let's see. As you can see in the example above, we have the new version of the with animation function, allowing us to provide animation compression handler. It is a great addition, and you can build phased animation now also. So let's see. So now when you call with animation, you can also provide a compression handler, which can be nice if you want to either chain animations together or if you want something to happen in your app once animation is over. It's true that it was something that was missing from SwiftUI, because in UIKit, since the beginning, when you were doing UIView.animate, you could always provide a compression handler. And even though personally I've never encountered a situation where I needed the compression handler and the fact that there wasn't one was an issue, the fact that we have this nice little addition, I would say it's great because it's something that is kind of hard to implement by yourself. You can't really implement it by yourself without doing some weird, unreliable hacks, like getting the timing of the animation and then setting off a timer. You know, that kind of thing that have a lot of chances to break at some point. So that's great that they've added this nice little addition. But one of the big additions to animations, and it was mentioned during the platform's State of the Union, is the addition of phased animations. So you can see an example here. So we have an enum which describes the phases of our animation. So start, loading, and finish. Since we have different offsets for something in the UI, and it depends, the offset depends on the phase. And so then we have the phased animation view. So let me display everything on the screen. So it's a view. There is a value set to false here. So I guess it's the trick where you switch the value to true to start the animation, I guess, because in the body, so we have a phase animator. We give it an array of all the phases, and we get it through the all cases property. So because the enum conforms to case iterable, we get a static member with an array that contains all the cases. And we say, okay, so given a phase, here is my animation. And so we have a loading view with a different offset. So the offset is to change on the y coordinates, to make the view move on the y coordinates. So I guess it starts at 100, so it would be a bit to the right, then go to the left, and then back to the middle. I guess it's something like that. And so this is the view to be animated, and then we have the actual animation, which also gets the phase as an argument. And so we switch over it, and we say, so when we start, it's an is-in. Okay, if we want to have different timing functions for the animation, and you can see that the start animation, the animation for the start phase is an is-in that takes 300 milliseconds. Then the loading part is in out and takes longer, so half a second, and the finish is out and it takes 0.1 second. And so let's see the explanation for this code. So the SwiftUI framework introduces a new phase animator view that iterates over the sequence of phases, allows you to provide different animations for every phase, and updates the content whenever phase changes. There is also the keyframe animator view, allowing us to animate changes with keyframe. So there is no example of keyframe animation. So in a way, keyframe, it's more like phase animation, but with even more control. Keyframes, the idea is that you say, okay, for instance, at 30% of my animation, I want my view to have this scale. Then at the end, I wanted to have that scale, and the animation will take care of interpolating the values in the middle. If you ever did video editing and you had to deal with keyframe animations in a video editor like Final Cut Pro, for instance, or Adobe Premiere, it's the exact same thing that is coming to SwiftUI. So that's pretty cool because I mean, for animations in SwiftUI, I've often used like Lottie animations because often when the designer is creating the animation, it's easier for them to export them as an After Effects animation, and so you can play it using Lottie on iOS. But if the animation is simple enough, I guess you can implement some simple animations this way because the code is pretty short. So that's a cool new addition. Definitely also, I guess if you're an iOS developer, you might want to make your designer aware of this because they might not be following all the details of all the announcements at WWDC, but this one is pretty important. So you might want to make them aware that now it's possible to do phase animation and keyframe animations natively in SwiftUI. Then we move on to scroll view. So scroll view has excellent additions this year. First, we can observe content offset using the scroll position view modifier. So this is something that was indeed missing a lot because there was no way to observe the content offset natively. At least I remember that John Sundell wrote an article on how to make it work, but it was not natively, and it was doing not some hack, but some workaround to be able to get this data. And so here we have this code example, and let's see the explanation. So as you can see, we use the scroll position view modifier here to bind the content offset to a state property. Interestingly, the content offset here is just an int. I would have expected to be a point. Actually. So let's see if there is some detail about this. Whenever the user scrolls the view, it updates the binding by setting the identity of the first visible view. Oh, okay, so it's not directly the content offset, actually, it's the ID of the view that is the first visible. So there was already this notion of ID in a scroll view because using a scroll view proxy, you could ask the scroll view to programmatically scroll to an element by giving the ID of this element. And so here it's because you get an ID. Okay, and so the ID is self, and since the ID is an int, that's why it's an int. Okay. So it's a more declarative way. You don't get like the coordinate in pixels, but rather you get the element that is first visible in the scroll view. Okay, and there is this scroll target layout. What does it do? I think it's what is explained next. So you can also scroll to any view by updating the binding programmatically. But remember that you should use the scroll target layout view modifier to tell the SwiftUI framework where to find identities to update the binding. So I guess, okay, so because we don't set IDs manually on each text, so when we do scroll target layout, I guess this is what SwiftUI uses to infer that the ID is the value that we have here, because we call it on the for each. Okay, so it's a way, that's nice. It's a way, by relying on the fact that for each already has the knowledge of an ID, because you either need to provide an explicit key path to the ID, or you iterate on something that conforms to the protocol identifiable. So since the ID is already known at the level of the for each, then we can use this information to automatically give that value to the scroll view. So it's a smart API that we have here. And the fact that it's both read and write, you can read the current content offset, but you can also set it programmatically. It's pretty cool that now it works both way. And so I guess the APIs that used to exist to do scroll to position, scroll to item. I don't remember the name actually, but a scroll to item by the ID or something like that. I guess they must have been deprecated because it's much better to use this approach. Plus, you don't even need to wrap the scroll view into a scroll view reader like you would need with the previous APIs. So that's pretty cool. Also, one of the reasons why I personally, but I think it's the case for all iOS developers, why I personally kind of like scroll views in SwiftUI, it's because scroll views in SwiftUI are much simpler to use out of the box than scroll views in UIKit, and seeing them become more powerful is definitely great. I see a message in the chat. When can we expect detailed videos on this from you? That's a good question. Historically, my videos about SwiftUI were never very popular because I guess people were not that much into the topic. But maybe we'll try to do a live stream of like exploring the new features of SwiftUI in iOS 17. But thanks for letting me know that you are interested. I will take it. I will take it into account. So let's see what we have next. You can now change the scroll behavior by using the scroll target behavior view modifier. It allows you to enable paging in a scroll view, so that's very nice also. So paging is this behavior, or when you scroll, it's kind of going to stick to, you won't be able to, when you release your finger, it will not stay where it is, but it will stick to the closest item. It's a behavior that was there in UI scroll views for a very long time, maybe even since the beginning of iOS. And now we can also do it with the scroll view in SwiftUI, and that's pretty cool because it can be very useful. For instance, if you have a typical example would be you have a horizontal scroll view with several like elements, maybe like I don't know, like you're in an e-commerce app and you have several products. Having paging enabled can be kind of nice, so that you are sure that the first element is always visible and is never like cut and maybe shown in a way that is not very flattering. I'm actually not sure if it's a good practice in an e-commerce app to do this, but it's just an example to highlight when it can be useful to use this paging behavior. So that's cool. I wasn't aware of this new behavior to UI scroll view, so I'm also learning things with this live stream, which is great. Then about the search. So we had in iOS 15 the introduction of the searchable API. So by now, more and more apps can use it, and it's a great API to implement easily a search bar into a view. So let's see what is new. So search-related view modifiers have a few great additions too. For example, you can programmatically focus on a search field. So let's see. We have in the code, as you can see in the example above, you can use the isPresented parameter of the searchable view modifier to show or hide the search field. So it's here. So we already had this part with the text that we pass. We pass a binding to a string, and this is what SwiftUI will update as the user types into the search bar. And so now we have isPresented also, which is a binding. And so here it's given a constant binding of true. This means that it will always be focused, I guess. And so you can use the isPresented parameter of the searchable view modifier to show hide the search field. You can also use the activation parameter of the search scopes view modifier to define scopes visibility logic. So this one, I'm less familiar with what it is. Let's see. So we have a default scope. Okay. And then, so depending on the scope, maybe the scopes is it's the thing that will display a segmented, a segmented controller where you can do you can select some mutually exclusive options. Maybe that's what it is, because here we have a list of products. Okay, so we have our searchable here. Okay, and then we have the search scopes, and here it says it's scope.rowValue. I don't see the code that would update the scope actually, so I'm not 100% sure, but I guess that's to be able to have some scope. Like for instance, if you're searching on your mail, do you want to search only in the VIP contacts or in all your contacts? That kind of thing. Let's see. Then we have some new gesture. So we have a new rotate gesture and magnify gesture, allow us to track the view's rotation and magnification. That's kind of cool because I remember like when I think it was when I was applying for my current job, I had to do a technical test that involved like images, and I wanted to do magnification, so a pinch to zoom gesture, basically, this gesture, and I saw at this moment that there was no easy way to do it actually in SwiftUI, so I dropped it and didn't implement it. But now it's easy to do, I guess, because we have the magnify gesture. So let's see. Here we have the rotate gesture added here, and so when it's changing, we change the angle, and the angle we use it for a rotation effect. So by doing this code, I guess the user can rotate the rectangle. And in a way, the fact that they added rotation and magnifying to SwiftUI, I think it might be linked to the introduction of VisionOS, because VisionOS seems to rely, at least for the pinch, from what I understand, it relies a bit on this feature. So making it available in SwiftUI, I guess, made a lot of sense. Okay, then we have the small addition. So I guess we've already covered all of the big topics. So we have the brand new content unavailable view type that we can use whenever we should display an empty view. It's a small but delightful addition that we will cover in one of the next articles in detail. But it's true that having this kind of view for an empty state built in into SwiftUI is great, because first it gives you an out-of-the-box solution, and also it kind of gives a standard guideline for what an empty view should look like. And I'm sure that there are people that will backport this for iOS 16 and before in open source, and this way you can use it in your project. And it's definitely a great addition, because adding an empty view is the kind of thing that is very important from the UX point of view, but adding it in code sometimes can be a bit frustrating, because you just need to add an extra view for something that is a special case, and so having a built-in like solution for it, I think it's pretty great. There are also a pair of new view modifiers allowing us to tune the spacing in a list. You can use the list row spacing and list section spacing view modifiers to set the spacing you need in the list. The environment values struct include a bunch of new properties related to the latest platform updates, like is activity full screen and show widget container background. So I guess this one is for the new mode where if you put your iPhone like horizontally on a MagSafe stand, then the widget is displayed but without a background. Swift charts also became scrollable and SF symbols animatable. And I've seen a lot of people writing some cool stuff about SF symbols animatable. There is also the new preview macro, allowing us to build previews more easily, and both for UIKit and SwiftUI, and also AppKit. So now for a preview, you just do #preview. You no longer need to declare a struct and make it conform to preview provider. And the great thing is that inside the preview, you can put SwiftUI views, of course, but also UIKit views or AppKit views if you are on a macOS target. So it can be quite useful. Like if you're working on a UIKit app, as soon as you support Xcode 15, you might be able to use previews. I say you might because in big projects, previews can still be like difficult to use because sometimes they fail to build that kind of thing. But at least the possibility is there. And in conclusion for this first article, there are tons of small additions all over the SwiftUI framework that we will cover during the upcoming month, so stay tuned to my blog and don't miss anything. I hope you enjoyed the post. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and ask your questions related to this post. Thanks for reading and see you next week. So if you've enjoyed this first article, I can only recommend that you go check out the blog Swift with Majid. You have the link to the article in the description. Let's move on to the second article. So same idea, but this time for UIKit. So we are on a new blog called SwiftJective C, and it's the blog of Jordan Morgan with an article written on June 5th, so on the day of the keynote, but I think Jordan lives in the US, so it makes it easier for him to write the content, because for him, the State of the Union happens like at 2 p.m. and not at 10:30 p.m. So that makes it a bit easier. Okay, let's get started. So I'm really starting to wonder why I write this annual post anymore. During the entirety of the platform State of the Union, I think I heard the term UIKit or UI View Controller twice, maybe three if you count the bit where the new preview syntax works for UIKit controls now. But alas, as long as the framework keeps chugging with diffs each WWDC, then I'll keep writing this annual post. To that end, here are some notable UIKit additions for iOS 17. If you want to catch up on this series first, you can view the iOS 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th versions of this article. So this is actually great because there are many apps that will in the coming month drop a version of iOS. For example, the app I work on, we only support the current and previous versions, so we will be dropping iOS 15 in September, which means that we will support iOS 16 as the lowest targeted version. And so this article, what's new in iOS 16 for UIKit, actually for us in September, it makes sense to read it. So if you're about to drop a version of iOS at work, remember it's always great to read what are the new API that you have access now with your new lower targeted version of iOS. So first, unavailable content. Yes, the empty data view. Here's the snippet code I currently use to implement it in UIKit, complete with Objective-C swizzling. So what do we have? Swizzle instance update method. So it's swizzling, and it's basically if there is, I guess it's to swizzle which method? So swizzling, if you don't know, it's a way to switch the implementation for a method in the Apple framework or in any framework with one of your own. And so here it's in perform batch update. I guess it's to be able to have automatically an empty view load when there is no content in your UI view or your UI collection view. That's interesting. That's an interesting approach. And here it says it's a little easier now. You just use UI content unavailable view. So what we saw just before, and in the config, so you have this. Yeah, so it's here. So it's this view. You get the empty version. You configure the text, the image, and you get you have the configuration, and then you create the view and you give it the configuration. So we still learn something here is that this before in the previous article we saw the SwiftUI version, so content unavailable view. But we also have a UIKit version, which I wasn't aware of actually, and it's nice to see that it's being added also to UIKit. And so UI content unavailable view, you give it the configuration, and it's going to give this result. So you can see we have an empty view, and we have the image and the text that has been configured. So this API is built on top of the content configurations that were introduced back in iOS 14. They have built-in configurations for a few things: empty states, loading states, and searching. So it's cool that we also have the loading state built-in. Actually, I guess there might be other initializers for the view in SwiftUI that might allow us to get a loading state, because it would be weird if they had implemented it in UIKit but not in SwiftUI. So now we know that it's also available in UIKit. Great information. Then the preview syntax. So as I mentioned in the opening, Swift's sleek new macros allow for Xcode preview support in UIKit. This didn't used to be straightforward, but it has always been possible, indeed, because you could so it's an article of the same blog that you could read, and the gist of it is that you would basically make just a container view or view controller, make it conform to UI view or UI view controller reprintable, so that you can call it from SwiftUI, and then you would pass a closure like with either that produces either a view or a view controller, and then the view or the view controller would add it as a sub view or a child view, and this would have made it work. But now you don't even need this. So if you have a view controller in your UIKit project, there is nothing preventing you from adding a preview at the end of the file. And if the preview manages to build, which, as I was saying, isn't always the case on big projects with some big dependencies, but it should display the preview. And if it works, it's definitely a nice little quality of life addition. Then we have automatic label vibrancy. So labels will now, at least on visionOS, automatically support vibrancy. From an API standpoint, it uses UI label vibrancy. So here we have a label, and we can set the preferred vibrancy to automatic. And on VisionOS, that's always set to automatic, but it's none everywhere else. Of note, you can only opt into vibrancy. You can't use this API to opt out of it. Plus, it will only affect situations where vibrancy would apply, which basically means when it's over system material. So it's when you have a view that is displayed over what SwiftUI calls system material. So you know it's this very blurry view where you can see, for instance, like the background. I don't know, like you could see like a background being blurred. And so I think VisionOS uses this a lot. I guess the way it displays like windows in 3D space, and so it makes sense that they have this automatic vibrancy because I guess they need to adjust the contrast between the text on the label and the background. Like because of the vibrancy, you could have something that is very vivid in the background, or something that is much more muted in terms of color. And I guess you need to treat these two situations differently for the text to be legible. I'm just making a hypothesis. It might not actually be that. Then we have symbol animations in buttons. So there is a whole lot of new API for animating SF symbols. I haven't dug into everything yet, but there are developer sessions later on this week over it. I'll be interested to learn more. In the meantime, there is API I'm seeing for UI button to get symbol animations by setting one property. So you create an action handler, you give it a title and an image, then you create a button, and you give it that action handler. You give a frame to the button, okay, and then finally on the property is symbol animated enabled, you set it to true, and it yields a nice little bubble bounce animation. So when you tap the button, yes, you can see there is a little like bounce, like a pulse on the icon, which is kind of cool, and it's just one boolean to enable. So it can be also a good thing here to let your designer be aware that this is possible and see if it makes sense to implement it in your app. And since it's just a Boolean property, you could always put this into some code that is only called if you're running on iOS 17. So this is available for UI bar button item as well. So both UI button and also UI bar button item, which is a bit of a different type in UIKit. Then symbol animations in images. So to stay on those symbol animations for a minute, these are too fun to mess around with. There are several built-in symbol animations, and they all appear to use those juicy spring animations. So it's true that at least in SwiftUI, spring animations have become the default for animations. For example, if you want an up arrow that looks like it's drawing 14 cups of coffee, here you go. So you create a symbol view by creating a UI image using an image from SF symbol. So you give it a bound, a content mode, and then you use this new API, so add symbol effect. You give it, I guess, a bounce effect. I guess it's a pre-existing effect. You see it's repeating, animated. And so you get a closure with the context to say, okay, when it's finished, but here, since it repeats, I guess it never finishes. And by doing this, the button is going to just like be animated like this, where we can see this bounce effect, and we can see the little spring animation where it goes a little bit past the end value and then comes back. So that's pretty cool. You definitely don't want to put this everywhere in your UI, but if you have the right place for it, once again, let your designer be aware that this is possible. And even better, combine it with the variable fill APIs added last year, and you can come up with some truly interesting effects. So we have a timer. The timer will publish every 350 milliseconds. And here we are switching over a count. Okay, so I guess the idea is to increment the count. So it goes from 0 to 0 to 0.2, from 0.2 to 0.6, from 0.6 to 1, and then back to 0. So basically there are several phases, I guess. I guess there are several phases that happen. Then there is a guard let on the fill count. So here, what is happening is that the buttons are, the three dots are being animated independently, but there might not be all of the code because, for instance, I'm not sure of what the field count is. Oh no, it's okay, it's just the count, okay? And so if there is a count, then in the symbol image, we get, oh, okay, so I get it. This symbol, it can have so a field count, and I guess the field count is this value from 0 to 1. And so here, depending on the value from 0 to 1, it will return either an image, with the three dots grayed out, only 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so I wasn't aware that this API existed. It's a nice way to implement a loader, to implement a loader that is a little bit nicer than the basic progress view. Okay, and so we have this, and the new API, which one is it? So, okay, so this is the variable fill API, and I guess it's being combined with this add symbol effect. Okay, yes, it's the two are being combined, just we don't see the code for the add symbol effect here. And so we can see the bouncy behavior combined with the dots being progressively filled as time advances. Okay, that's interesting. And we can see that you can do the same thing with this rainbow symbol, or here to have things change from one to the other. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Typically, if you're an indie developer, so you don't have a designer on your team, and you want to make something that looks cool, but you don't have a lot of design resources, this can be a pretty cool approach, because you can make something that looks pretty cool using the standard APIs. So pretty cool from Apple to have included this. Then we have more fun styles. So we have extra large title and extra large title 2 when you want something that is really, really big. Okay. I'm not a designer, so I'm not sure when you would actually use either of them. I'm not sure also if there are some APIs in either UIKit or SwiftUI or maybe Vision OS that use this extra large title. But now it does exist, at least. You have new text content types, so there are additions to boost autofill, specifically for credit cards and birthdays. So on the text field, if it's a birthday, you can say it, and this way iOS is able to suggest the birthday of the user. Same thing for credit cards. That's pretty cool, because it was already there on Safari. On Safari, you can have credit card autofill, but it's true that I guess we didn't have something similar for native apps. And it might be one of these situations where we had the autofill available in Safari, so on the web, but not on native apps. Or maybe it was relying on some heuristics to understand when there is a credit card view. But at least now we can do it also natively. Also, one thing that's true is that there is a lot of apps that, when it comes to entering the credit card, they go to a web view, because if you are integrating with an external payment provider, sometimes they give you a web view to put the payment information, and so it's simpler to do it. But at least, I mean, the more autocomplete and autofill you have, the better it is. I guess now that we've had autofill for email and password, we know how cool it is, and we also notice it when an app doesn't implement it correctly. So it's pretty cool to see these little additions. And Flo, you're saying, just tuning in for a few minutes, how has been your WWDC week so far? Busy. Very busy, because this year I was I want to make a lot of content, but also very interesting because it's a great moment to experiment with new things. So pretty pleased with it, but I think I will be taking things much more cool and chill this weekend. I hope you also had a great WWDC week. I saw that you posted videos very early on, and you kind of like inspired me in doing the same thing, but with live streams at the end of the day. So great job, especially on the Swift Data video, for instance, that you managed to post extremely quickly after the framework was released. So great job. And I saw you did also other videos this week. So it seems you've also been very busy. Then we have a few UIKit nuggets. So of course, I always write this before the developer sessions drop, so a lot more is coming. Here are things I saw but didn't cover because I don't quite understand them fully, or I couldn't get them to work in beta 1. So there have been a lot of changes in trade collection. You can make entirely custom trade collection, fire arbitrary logic when they change, and that's in addition to bringing them to the SwiftUI's environment. So that's pretty cool. I wonder also if it's connected to maybe VisionOS, because the trade collection might be getting more complex as VisionOS operates in a 3D space. Text sizing rules. There is a new sizing rule property for labels, text fields, and text views, which appear to control sizing based off of font ascenders and descenders when using preferred font styles. Okay, I'm not that much well versed into the details of a font, so I'm not exactly sure what this means. If you know more, like feel free to share it in the chat, because I am not that much aware of the details of this. Then scene activation. I'm seeing a lot of changes around scene and how they activate. I assume this is to support the new Spaces stuff in VisionOS, which kind of makes sense. So you can kind of see a scene as a window, and I guess to gain and lose focus for a window in VisionOS, it might be a bit more complex, because if everything is eye activated, maybe there are new possible states there. So actually, if you want to get some insight on how VisionOS works, you might want to take a look at these APIs. Then for the menus, so related but not specifically iOS, you'll see that context menu interactions are available on tvOS now. So context menu interaction, I think it's what you get when you stay pressed on an item. For instance, if you long press on an item and you see a menu appearing. Interesting that they bring it to tvOS, because I know, for instance, the YouTube app on tvOS has this UX pattern where you need to stay pressed on the button of the remote, but it's true that it uses its own UI for this, and I don't remember seeing the native apps from Apple doing it, but I might be wrong on this one. But at least if that's the case, then maybe YouTube will be able to use the default interaction, which would be pretty cool. Regarding Vision OS, so of course we can't forget this one. It's not every day we get a new device idiom. So we have UI user interface idiom reality, just like we had pad and phone. Efficient images. There is a new UI image reader that seems interesting, allowing to tweak like pixels per inch, thumbnail size, and more. It appears to be meant for downsampling or efficient decoding. That's interesting because resizing is definitely complex. And since I work on an image editing app for my job, I see a bit of this. And so having some code that can take care of applying the right downsampling algorithms, I guess it's a great thing, because when you don't do it correctly, I'm sure you've already experienced it, like you get a very pixelated image that doesn't look good at all. So having a way to do it that looks good and that is efficient from a computation point of view is kind of great. And finally, smart text entry. So support for the inline text prediction enhancement. So one of the AI-powered features, even though they didn't say AI in the keyword, but autofill is supposed to have gotten better thanks to leveraging large language models. Final thoughts. So what else is there to say? The messaging has officially shifted. It started with UIKit and SwiftUI are both great ways to build an app, and we've got great ways to put the UIKit stuff into SwiftUI, so you can use the SwiftUI only APIs. And last year it was straight up, SwiftUI is the best way to build an app. This year, UIKit really had the nail in the coffin feeling to me, even though that's hyperbolic, but it's not where the puck is going, and Apple has made that abundantly clear. Does that bother me? No, not at all. I'm not going away, much like Objective-C is still here. That's true if you work on big apps, like for instance, I know that Instagram still uses a lot of Objective-C, and I always celebrate how efficient, robust, and capable the framework has been for my career and still is. But that was then, and now it's all about visionOS, interactive widgets, the list goes on, and I'm here for it, but I'll still never forget the framework that got me started in this biz. Long live UIKit, until next time. It will be very interesting when they release the SDK for visionOS in a month, from what they say, to see like, will SwiftUI and UIKit be equal citizens with equal rights in that framework, or will there be some preferences for SwiftUI, or will some APIs from UIKit be forbidden on visionOS? You know, like for instance, when they introduced Mac Catalyst, UI WebView was forbidden. Oh, seems like Siri triggered automatically on one of my phones. Yeah, I was saying when they introduced Catalyst, you couldn't use UI WebView on it. It might be possible that maybe some UIKit types won't be available on visionOS. I'm very curious to learn more about it. But if you're still like me using UIKit daily, it's good to know that there are still new APIs for it. So that was the second article. Once again, if you've enjoyed it, please check out the rest of this blog. So Swift Objective-C, the link is in the description. For the next article, we have a much shorter article, but I wanted to share it to make sure that you did get the info. So it's about Xcode previews with UIKit and AppKit in Xcode 15. So in the past, before Xcode 15, there was no easy way to use Xcode previews for non-SwiftUI components, even though there was still a way to use it that wasn't that hard, to be honest. If you want to preview your UI view or UI view controller, you need to wrap it as SwiftUI view with either UI view representable or UI view controller representable, but you could wrap a generic wrapper around it. So there were still ways around this. In Xcode 15, however, we can easily create previews with new and more concise syntax using the hashtag preview macro. This new syntax brings support previewing for a wide range of views, SwiftUI, UIKit, AppKit, widget timeline providers, timeline entries, and live activities. So how to preview UIKit and AppKit in Xcode 15. To preview any view with the new hashtag preview macro, we just put the view you want to preview inside the macro. So here we have the macro with a SwiftUI button, here the macro with a UIKit button, and here the macro with an AppKit NS button. And that's basically it. So very short article, but if you have a project that uses UIKit and it manages to build on iOS 15 without too much issues, maybe you might want to give a try to see whether the preview support works, because if it works fine for you, then you will know that starting when Xcode 15 gets its official release, you will be able to use previews in your development flow. And it can be quite useful, especially when you're working on an app and you don't have a debug view to easily instantiate a view controller, and so you need some time to navigate to a screen that might be like a bit nested into the view hierarchy. Having a preview to display it and iterate on the design of the view quickly can be very cool. That's why I really wanted to drive home this point that you can use previews with UIKit and AppKit from now on. Okay, moving on to another blog that I'm sure you are familiar with. We've already covered it several times in this live newsletter format. So it's Swiftly, the blog of Antoine van der Lee. And his article this week focuses on content unavailable view, so handling empty states in SwiftUI, one of the cool additions we briefly covered in the first article. So this time, let's learn about it in more details. So content unavailable view is a SwiftUI view introduced in iOS 17 during WWDC 2023. It allows you to handle cases of networking failure or empty search results. It's essential to explain an empty state and its cause to your users. While you can generate custom empty states, reusing standard SwiftUI components is convenient. Doing so will speed up your development process while you benefit from consistent and accessible UI simultaneously. two very good arguments, and I would say unless you have some very strong branding that doesn't work with what SwiftUI has provided, for this kind of empty states view or error view, using standard approaches is kind of nice, because since they are used in cases where you are dealing with a situation that is outside of the happy path, so you are dealing with a kind of an exception in a way, having something that feels familiar to the user in the context of something that is exceptional in the state of your app is kind of a nice way to not have the user feel completely lost. You can still bring some, you can still root this exceptional situation in a sense of familiarity, and that's a great argument for using this standard view. So making use of standard unavailable views, SwiftUI provides a set of ready-to-use unavailable views for common scenarios. For now, these only cover 2 different search empty states, but it could be possible more variants will follow in later releases. Empty search states are common, and by reusing SwiftUI standard component, you'll show a familiar view to your users with ease. For example, you might have a view to search in a list of articles, so like this. So we have searchable, and we put an overlay. And so in the overlay, we say if search results are empty, if search results are empty and the search text isn't empty, meaning if the user has typed a search query and it returned nothing, then we can overlay this content unavailable view. It's a nice use of the overlay modifier, because often when you want to deal with these empty states, it might result in code that is more complex. For instance, you might want to introduce an enum and a switch in the body, but using overlay is a great way to do it if the view is opaque, and I guess it must be the case. So that's pretty great. And so with this code, if there aren't any search results while the query is non-empty, we can show the new content unavailable view. The outcome view looks as follow. So we have an icon, text in bold, and another text with a lighter font and color. And so let's see. So we just said content unavailable view.search. So we said nothing else. So this is all default behavior. And I guess we can also customize it. So you can also use the search variant by providing the search query. So you can give the search query as the text, and then in this case, oh, that's nice. It says no result for the query. So that's pretty cool. It's really like a plug and play. You can use it out of the box. I really like what they did with this component. And so the resulting view looks familiar to your users since it's widely used across the system. Another benefit is that the content unavailable view automatically translates into the language your app supports. Note that it will only translate to languages your app supports, so that you won't have a single view being localized only. That's pretty smart from Apple. And also another advantage is that since the search interface here is already the standard approach by using the searchable modifier, having also a standard empty view makes sense, because this way it's kind of like, either you do everything custom or you do nothing custom, but doing standard for the search bar UI, but custom for the search result can be a bit confusing for users. Now let's see about creating a custom content unavailable view. So while using the default provided variants is recommended, you can create custom unavailable views to match your design or handle different cases. You'll have to manage localization and labels yourself, which results in more flexibility. In our example, we're going to provide a custom empty view that better matches our articles view. So we create the view, but this time we provide more arguments. So first, for the title, we say no articles for, and then we use string interpolation to inject the search text. We give a different system image, so using SF symbol. And for the description, we pass in a text and we say try to search for other titles, something that is more suited to the domain of our app. Interestingly, we can pass a text, which might mean that we could pass some arbitrary view and maybe have some more custom things in this part. So we've used a convenience initializer in this case, but we can write the same code using the more flexible initializer. So content unavailable view, and we pass in a label, and then another one for the description. So there are these two available initializers, okay? This initializer is excellent for extra flexibility, as you can use any view. Using the content unavailable view this way results in the following output. So we can see we have the icon we specified, we have the text we specified, and same thing for the description. And since we can pass here really any view we want, it could go even more customized. So basically, it's more the layout that is provided out of the box, but you could customize it with things that are closer to your branding. So it's kind of nice that there is this level of flexibility. And while we've primarily focused the unavailable view to handle search results, you can also use it for other scenarios like network request failure. The content unavailable view provides convenience and allows you to match the system design with ease. So indeed, here we could also deal if there is an error to say here an error happened, for instance. So here you would have maybe like an icon with like I don't know, like some kind of cross. Here you say an error happened, and here maybe try again. Maybe write some error code that your user can report to your support. Maybe even, since you can pass any view, maybe a button with a link to open the support or the help section of your app could be pretty cool. So it's a nice little addition. And even though it's probably iOS 17 only, you can still take inspiration from how it has been designed, both from a UI perspective and from an API perspective, to implement your own version. And like I think I've said a bit earlier, we can definitely expect some people in the community to provide some open source version that use the same API, but that you can use in iOS 16 and before. And so in conclusion, SwiftUI's content unavailable view allows you to provide feedback to users about the content being unavailable. You can use standard implementations like empty search results or create custom implementations. While custom implementations result in flexibility, standard variants have the benefit of being localized out of the box. Of course, you can localize your own custom implementations. And then you have some links to learn more about what Antoine has on his blog. So once again, a great article. I can only encourage you to check out his blog. The link is in the description. And finally, last article I wanted to cover in this live stream, it's about observation x SwiftUI. So we're going to focus on this new observable macro and protocol. So SwiftUI's first, where are we? We are on the blog of Alex Logan, which was in the chat just a little bit earlier. So if you're still here, we are finishing with your article about observation. So SwiftUI state management just got way simpler thanks to the new @observable macro. So observable is the new way to say you can observe this, and it's a macro built right into the language. It's not a part of SwiftUI or Combine, but Swift, and as we saw before, it doesn't even rely on Combine under the hood anymore. Let's take the example of a simple counter class to demonstrate this. First up, let's see what that would look like yesterday. So we will have a class, counter, make it conform to the protocol observable object, import Combine, and mark our observable property with @published, so that when the property gets a new value, it triggers a refresh of the UI. Next, let's look at the usage of the new @observable macro. We need to import observation, add observable to the class, and then remove published. So it's definitely a simpler code. Well, that doesn't look too different, but there's some special behavior to consider here. If we were to add more properties to counter, we'd have to add @published to each, but with observable, we just have to make the variables public and they get observability by default. Interesting. So here the variable is actually internal because nothing is specified. So I guess by public, I guess it means public and internal, and it's private variables that are excluded from observability. And it kind of makes sense because private variables, since they cannot be accessed from the outside, it makes sense that they are not observable. I think it would be when the getter is private, because if you have just the setter being private, then you can still observe it from the outside. I'm not sure actually what the behavior is, but it's interesting to see that there is these edge cases to take into account. Then observing. So the most obvious way to observe something like this would be SwiftUI. The first thing to consider is getting this data into your view. We don't use @ObservedObject anymore, and we won't be able to use @StateObject either because it's no longer an observable object. This leaves us with the option of storing it as an @state variable or simply passing it through our top level app. So here we just store the counter in a let constant, and it is passed through the argument. And there is no @state because here the content view doesn't own the counter. The counter is owned at the app level, so it makes sense that it's not @state because ownership is not at the content view level. So observing our property is as easy as with an observable object. Let's quickly build out a view for our counter. So we still have the counter in the content view, then navigation stack, vstack. So we display a text with the counter count being formatted. And then we have an h tag with two buttons, one button to decrease the counter and one to increase the counter, okay? When we tap on the buttons, the view updates just like we expect from @published. So when the counter is incremented or decremented here, it triggers a redraw of the text that is just above in the UI. To validate that the view is updating when we expect, we can always use the trick to do a let underscore equal self dot underscore print changes, which is a private function that we can call in development to be aware whenever there is a new, when the body of our view is being regenerated. So we can put this at the top of the view body to print changes out of the console. If you add that now, you'll see every button tap fires a reload. Observable includes something clever to avoid unneeded view updates. So let's add a new property to our counter. So now we have a count and a string. So both properties are observable because they are both visible from the outside of the counter class. Next, let's add a button to change that property. So we have a button that changes the string and that puts just a new UUID into that string, so a different value every time. And tap on that button and you'll notice nothing prints from print changes. That's because SwiftUI and Observable play nicely and only set up observation for the stuff you actually observe. And that's a different behavior than what we had with @published, where whenever an @published property was changed, it would trigger the body being recomputed. That might not mean that the UI would be updated because the bodies could be identical, but it would still be recomputed and then compared with the previous body. And now, the observable framework is able to say that, okay, since only the count is being read from the counter, then I need to recompute the body only when the count has changed. And since the string isn't read anywhere inside the body, then SwiftUI can infer that the body doesn't depend on that second property. And so if it changes, there is no need to recompute the body. And when I was saying that there are some tricky edge cases, I was referring exactly to this, that from what I understand, if you had read the count inside the list view, then it wouldn't have redrawn the view by default. So maybe the article will cover this later, and if it doesn't, you might want to make sure, as I was saying, that you read the full documentation of Observable before you use it. Otherwise, you might run into some weird behavior. Okay, so we left here, and then we have bindings. So let's look at a common use case for @state or @binding property, a text field. So here's a simple view with a state property and a text field for you to enter your name. So we have a view that creates an @state, which is a name, okay? And there is a form and a text field, and you pass a binding to the @state name to that text field. So converting that to use observation like we have earlier actually throws an error. We don't have a binding anymore. So $name no longer exists in the sense that @state must work differently when you use observation and when you used combine under the hood, I guess. Oh no, okay, I get it. It's because so now there is no longer the @state. There is no longer the @state, and so of course, if you don't have the @state, you cannot get a binding out of it. Luckily, there's something available to solve this at Bindable. To use this, we need to clean up our code a little bit. First, we can move our name into a model that we mark as observable, so what we have done just before. Next, let's get this into our view and mark it as at Bindable, which then allows us to use $model.name like we'd expect if this was an observable object. So actually, I'm wondering if I don't see the bindable. I'm wondering if here it's not missing the add bindable, because I feel like something is missing in the code, because here we do have an observable view model, but here I don't see the moment where add bindable is being used. I'm going to search for it. Yeah, no, it's nowhere in the code. So actually, I'm not sure. It might be missing here. At least with what I've used when I was using Swift Data, it would make sense for me that here this would be an at bindable. Yeah, this is whenever you make content when there is something new, it's so easy to make a mistake or to forget something or do a bad copy paste. So okay, I guess you confirm, Alex, that that here the model should be at bindable, and this at bindable allows you to derive a binding for the name being stored in that model. All of that to say that observation is definitely a new thing to learn. Of course, you don't need to learn it like by the end of the week. You will have time to migrate your app progressively. And anyway, observation, from what I understand, is iOS 17. So if your app still supports iOS 15 or even 16, which will be the case of the majority of apps, you probably will need to wait maybe at least 1 year until you can use observation only inside your app. But if you're about to start a new project and you know that it will be released like close to the release of iOS 18, it's very possible that you might be setting iOS 17 as the minimum target version for your project. And so then building your entire project using observation, so this new @observable macro makes total sense. So that's why I wanted to finish this live by covering this last article on the topic. I hope you've enjoyed this last live stream for me from this WWDC week. It's been a busy week, but like with every year, I feel like it was worth the effort because there have been a lot of cool new announcements, and it's really exciting to get to know them. Don't forget to not put yourself too much pressure to learn everything. Also, don't forget that the software we have right now is still in beta. It's marked explicitly in the doc. So this means that API can change a bit by the time it is released. There might be some subtle edge cases that will behave differently. So unless you're planning to use these new technologies in September when iOS 17 is released, maybe you don't want to spend too much time to learn all of the details right now, because some of these details might change in the future. But at least it's always great to see that we have so much cool content released by the iOS community. Apple's documentation is not always the best, even though I feel this year they've made some effort. Remember yesterday when we learned about macros, we actually had some great documentation to help us along the way. But there is always the great content of the community that we can rely on. And so if you want to keep learning about the new features of the WWDC, just follow the links I've put in the description and read the rest of these 5 blogs. You will find some great content. And to finish, I just have to say thank you for watching my content during this week, whether it was the video or the live streams on YouTube or the post on social media. I will definitely keep making more content in the weeks to come. If there are some some topics that you would particularly want me to cover, please let me know in the comments of this live stream or on social media or anywhere. I'm always very curious to have this kind of feedback from the audience. And I guess I just have to say thank you for watching this live stream, and see you next time. Bye bye.